Do you ever get that feeling? That unexplainable one you know I'm talking about? The one where 1 second everything seems normal and the next, it feels like you're being watched. It's weird. That sudden spike of paranoia can twist your mind into believing all sorts of things. Who or what has decided we make interesting prey for their eyes? It's rare when we find out, and sometimes we don't want to know. Unfortunately, for those residing around the Big Sur mountain range in California, the discovery of the shadowy entities who dwell there have put the residents on edge. Sometimes ignorance is bliss, but it's hard to ignore the presence of the Dark Watchers. I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins, and you're listening to Moonlight Lore. Acting as a shield for the rest of the state, the Santa Lucia Mountains tower over the crashing waves of the Pacific and are the last to feel the warmth of the sun as it sets beyond the blue horizon. And it's when the late twilight hour hits, is when those who find themselves near the mountains know it's time to retreat inside. Not only because it's the end of the day, but also because something materializes on top of the rocky peaks. Spanish settlers who first arrived in the area called them Los Vigilantes Obscuros, the Dark Watchers. Over the course of hundreds of years since California was first colonized to the present day, their presence is still a mystery. Nobody knows what they are, where they come from, or what their purpose is, but what people do know is they observe us. Staring from a distance, their hulking, shadowy bodies stand perfectly still, almost as if they were scarecrows, standing vigil over their mountain territory and disappearing when someone dares to venture too close. Despite these entities supposedly being around for hundreds of years, it's rare when a person is granted the fortunate luck of witnessing one. It's because of this fact that we know very little about them. We know they have been here for a long time if we are to believe the legends, but anything else remains rather vague. However, we do know one thing. Every sighting that has occurred over the course of the past several centuries identify them as the same over and over again. If you were to quickly catch a glimpse of one right before it disappeared, your eyes would meet a slender, shadowy figure standing roughly around 10 feet or 3 meters tall. Aside from the fact their obsidian appearance obscures any details of their face or body, some reports of sightings have claimed two pure white eyes absent of any pupils can sometimes be seen fixed on their faces, leaving much to be desired when one wishes to determine their sentiment. Interestingly enough, it's what these figures are often seen wearing is what causes people to do a double take. They are said to don wide-brim hats atop their heads, along with long flowing cloaks that some often construed as being capes flowing in the wind. In their hands, they hold a firm grip on a walking stick or long cane. They often are said to heavily lean on while they stand and stare. And that's it. Like I said, even though they are believed to have been around for hundreds of years, it's difficult to gain a sense of specific details about them. The reason for this is mainly because when you notice they are there, they vanish into thin air almost immediately or dart behind one of the many jagged rocks dotting the mountainside. Reported sightings of them are extremely rare to come across. So when one does manage to catch a glimpse, it's only for a split second or two. Not to mention, when someone does manage to focus their eyes on them, they are often at a distance, so determining any kind of small details about their appearance is nearly impossible. By all accounts, the Dark Watchers are as mysterious as they are elusive. This doesn't necessarily mean, though, that throughout history there haven't been a few instances where people have gotten close to them. Over the course of the past several centuries, there are a few people living in California who have had a story to share. Brief descriptions of the Dark Watchers can be found in nearly every corner of California. Along with the Fresno Nightcrawlers, they have become one of the state's most popular urban legends. So there's bound to be some stories about them. Nearly every online article claims the Dark Watchers date back even further than when the Spanish colonized the area and gave them their ominous name. All of those articles like to point their fingers at the Chumash Native Americans for reassurance of the existence of these entities. These people have inhabited the land for roughly 13 to 14,000 years, so surely they would have some stories to share about them. Unfortunately, many of those online articles like to copy and paste from one another because most of them make the same claim, that the Chumash people have lived alongside these strange entities and have interacted with them in some way. It's sometimes hard to believe what you read online, so when so many different articles say the same things word for word, I wanted to dig a little deeper and find out the truth, if the Chumash and the Dark Watchers actually lived side by side. This search led me down a bit of a rabbit hole, and I ended up reading several pages of a book written by author Thomas Blackburn. After going over hundreds of thousands of documents and archives meant to preserve the history of the Chumash people, he compiled and published the book called December's Child, a book of Chumash oral narratives. This book encompasses nearly everything we know about the ancient Chumash people, so it's certainly a good source of information when searching for any link to the Dark Watchers. And in the chapter titled The Three Worlds, there's a subchapter called the Nunaces. In here, Blackburn writes that they are creatures of the other world who come out soon after nightfall and travel all around the world. Hap is Nunaces. He is the form of a man, but he is very dangerous and very devilish. Unfortunately, in the entire Nunaces chapter, these are the only two lines that offer us any kind of vague similarity to the Dark Watchers. The chapter isn't very long, it's roughly only about 2 paragraphs, so my conclusion is that they likely never have had any sort of interaction with dark-cloaked entities who menacingly stand on top of the mountains and stare at the ocean or those who wander nearby. While there's some debate on whether or not the Chumash people ever really did have some kind of history with the entities known as Dark Watchers, what everyone does agree on are 2 more sources that go back several years that confirm the Dark Watchers have been around for at least the past century. The first being the famous published author John Steinbeck and his book of short stories titled The Long Valley, written in 1938. It's in the short story titled Flight do we get one of the first confirmed mentions of the Dark Watchers in known recorded history. The story revolves around a teenage boy named Pepe Torres, who accidentally murders a man in a drunken bar fight and is told by his mother to run away to avoid death by the hands of the law. As he was one step out the door, Pepe's mother offers him one last piece of advice. When thou comest to the high mountains, if thou seest any of the dark watching men, go not near them, nor try to speak to them, and forget not thy prayers. As Pepe continued on his escape, desperately traveling over one of the tall mountains in search for his freedom, that's when he finally had an encounter with one of the dark watching men his mother had warned him about. Pepe looked suspiciously back every minute or so, and his eyes sought the tops of the ridges ahead. Once, on a white barren spur, he saw a black figure for a moment, but he looked quickly away, for it was one of the Dark Watchers. No one knew who the Watchers were, nor where they lived, but it was better to ignore them and never to show interest in them. They did not bother one who stayed on the trail and minded his own business. And so that's what he did. Pepe didn't want any more trouble than what he already had, so as he strode on past, he avoided any kind of interaction with the mysterious man. But before he knew it, another close encounter reared its head. Pepe looked up to the top of the next dry, withered ridge. He saw a black form against the sky, a man's figure standing on top of a rock, and he glanced away quickly not to appear curious. When a moment later he looked up again, the figure was gone. It's interesting to note that Steinbeck considered these men on the mountain worthy of being named in his story. They provide very little in terms of the story development and more so act as part of the scenery than anything else. So why would he specifically add them in there? Did he possibly want to instill that fear of the unknown? Or perhaps as a warning to the main character that there is danger around every corner? Are the Dark Watchers a potential metaphor for something else? It's honestly a little hard to argue that they might be. The fact that Steinbeck specifically writes that nobody knows who they are or where they come from, and it's best to just ignore them, doesn't give us very much room to interpret them for something else. Off the top of my head, I thought maybe perhaps they could be the lawmen, a way the main character and his mother would villainize them by calling them dark, mysterious figures hiding among the rocks of the mountains, lying in wait for their prey. Pepe is then also instructed to avoid making eye contact with them and pretend they don't exist, maybe in a way to avoid suspicion and being caught by them. It's unlikely, but it's the only interpretation I could think of while writing this episode. But I firmly believe Steinbeck intended for these entities to be unique characters. Dark, mysterious figures that only observe and stare, and don't necessarily serve a purpose to the development of the story as a whole, kind of just like how they are said to behave in real life. Quiet observers who otherwise don't interact with their surroundings. But now let's look into our second source. A year before Steinbeck published his book, another author/poet named Robinson Jeffers wrote and released a short poem called Such Counsels You Gave to Me, and in it describes the Dark Watchers. But when he approached the fall of the hill towards Howens, he saw apparently a person on the verge, outlined against the darkening. Commissurer of the farther hills, intently gazing into the valley. The young man's tired and dulled mind, bred in these hills, taught in the city, reverted easily towards his dead childhood. He thought it might be one of the Watchers, who are often seen in this length of coast range. Forms that look human to human eyes, but certainly are not human. They come from behind ridges and watch, but when he approached it, he recognized the shabby clothes and pale hair, and even the averted forehead and the concave line from the eye to the jaw, so that he was not surprised when the figure turning towards him, in the quiet twilight, showed his own face. Then it melted and merged into the shadows beyond it. The young man thought heavily that in his state of mind and body hallucination was not surprising. In his poem, Jeffers described the Watchers as if again they were unique entities who look human to human eyes, but are definitely not considered human, just like how Steinbeck would describe them a year later. But this poem tells the story of a young man fondly remembering his dead childhood and recent past. The Watchers in this case are him, and a reflection of himself as one who watches and remembers what had come before, and not necessarily a separate shadowy character. This could have influenced Steinbeck in his writings that came out a year later when he described the Dark Watchers as mysterious men on the mountain. Perhaps there's a chance he misinterpreted Jeffers' poem slightly and believed they were literal watchers in the hills. This, I would say, would be unlikely. Being an author, Steinbeck likely would have been able to interpret Jeffers' work for what he intended and know the Watchers were merely just a reflection to describe the young man's self. The two also differ slightly in both works. In Steinbeck's story, the Dark Watchers are dark figures who are potentially dangerous men. When you see one, it's best not to look at it and carry on as if you saw nothing. In Jeffers, he describes them as shadows who look human but are certainly not what they appear. For two authors to passively mention these Watchers in both of their works, and both having lived near the Big Sur mountain range during the same time, it makes one stop and wonder if there really had been some kind of entities they were using as references. If this is the case, then knowledge of the Dark Watchers being present in the area should predate the 1930s, but unfortunately any kind of solid information or written text describing them before these two stories isn't really known to exist. There are rumors online that Steinbeck's mother, having also believed in these creatures, and would supposedly travel up the mountain with a basket of fruit and nuts to leave behind as an offering, only for her to return later with the intention on delivering more, only to find the food missing and replaced by a single flower. Now again, there's really no evidence to say that she actually did this. It's likely just an online fabrication created in an effort to solidify the existence of these figures. But even if she truly did believe in the Dark Watchers and ventured up into the mountains to leave behind food for them, the food was likely just taken by small wild animals. If you leave small fruits and nuts outside, especially on a mountain, they will be taken by birds or rodents who eat those things as part of their diets. Steinbeck's mother may have very well believed in the Dark Watchers like people on the internet so often like to claim, but there's really no solid evidence to support that she really did. And as for the fruits and nuts, I personally need irrefutable proof showing a Dark Watcher actually creeping out from behind a rock to steal them away. Otherwise, I think we can safely assume wildlife is to blame for the missing food. The concept of tall, shadowy figures stalking an area is certainly not one that is new, nor is it restricted to just California. If you're familiar with sleep paralysis and the effects it has on people, then you may have come across some stories regarding what people have seen while suffering from it. While a person is frozen in place, drifting between consciousness and sleep, they sometimes will encounter an entity, who are often said to be seen standing in the doorway or in a dark corner of their room staring at them. These entities are known as shadow people, ghostly figures who are completely shrouded in darkness, void of any features, just like how the Dark Watchers are described. But unlike the Watchers in California, shadow people have been reported to be seen in many places around the world. Sometimes they can be caught seen in graveyards, old abandoned buildings, or in forests. It's not clear what their purpose is, where they come from, or what they truly are, so many believers have been quick to link the Dark Watchers to shadow people. Now, whether or not this link between the two is solid enough to explain the figures people are seeing on top of the Santa Lucia Mountain Range, that remains to be learned. Skeptics have pointed out that what people are possibly seeing aren't actually any spectral entities, but rather something far more easier to explain. Pareidolia, the tendency to see patterns where there is none. Examples of this would be seeing shapes of animals or objects in clouds, or the famous face on Mars that has since been confirmed to be a natural rock formation. Since Dark Watchers are only ever seen during twilight hours, when shadows become long and the sunlight begins to die or just starts to rise, the shadows created by the swaying trees in the ocean wind or the jagged rocks embedded in the earth can create odd-looking patterns for people who then believe they are seeing a strange figure off in the distance. Remember, people only ever see the Watchers from far off. If those people who are experiencing pareidolia then decide to investigate, if they approach or stand at a different angle than they were before, or even if enough time has passed so that the light of the sun causes the shadows to have disappeared, they may believe the dark figure they thought they had seen had mysteriously disappeared into thin air. We could also then account for hallucinations playing a part in this as well. The highest point in the Santa Lucia Mountains is Big Sur's Cone Peak at over 5,000 feet or 1.5 kilometers high. Although this might not be considered especially high to some, considering those hiking the mountains typically stay within around the 3,000 to 4,000 foot range, if they are inexperienced or not adapted to the lower air pressure, they may start to feel uncomfortable. At sea level, oxygen pressure stays at a comfortable 21%, but around the 4,000 foot altitude mark, pressure goes down by 3% to 18%. Even at this level, the slightest change in pressure can be enough to have an effect on somebody and convince them they may have seen something strange off in the corner of their eyes, especially if those who are not accustomed to hiking in higher altitudes are fatigued, out of breath, and perhaps struggling for air. And let's consider this: if the legend of the Dark Watchers have been around for as long as people claim, then surely many who hike the mountains would know of the legends as well. And perhaps with that outside influence, they may see a shadow and immediately assume it was one of the Watchers by mistake. Now let's take a short journey over to Europe to talk about the phenomenon known as Brockenspector, also known as Mountain Spectre. On the Brocken Peak in the Harz Mountains in Germany, it was discovered in 1780 by Johann Silberschlag that while standing atop of the peak while the sun was down on the horizon, a tall shadow of their figure will appear in the fog behind the individual standing there. The image in the fog will appear magnified, an optical illusion created when the person standing on the mountain looks back at their shadow on the clouds and judges the distance of it to be further away than it actually is. The water vapor in the clouds can then also confuse people's depth perceptions as well, while causing the shadow to also move on its own as the clouds slowly drift by. Depending on the density and cloud layer, this can also cause the shadow to shrink or enlarge, making it as if it was its own separate entity moving by its own volition. If we consider weather patterns in California now, we know it can get quite hot there. The warm air that runs down the side of the mountains will collide with the colder air coming off from the ocean. This then creates what's called sea fog, and the reason why during the mornings and evenings, one can find a blanket of fog drifting over the surface of a large body of water. With the Santa Lucia Mountains literally standing on the edge of the water, the sea fog will drift up and around the peaks, which then would help create the Brockenspector phenomenon. And we're still not quite done yet. There's also a theory that the gentle ocean breeze can create low infrasound. If the sound of the wind stays below the threshold of human hearing at around 19 Hz or lower, it can create a feeling of uneasiness, anxiety, or even fear. If this is what's happening up on those mountains, and the soft breeze is creating infrasound, anyone up there will experience those specific feelings when moments before they hadn't. When the fog slowly sets in at the end of the day or early morning, and the sun is cresting the horizon, those who are surrounded by the shadows dancing across every rock, even their own, could possibly mistake it for the figure of a person who appears to be much larger than they actually are, thanks to the Brockenspector phenomenon. Then, if we want, we can also add pareidolia into the mix as well, so when our brains begin to form patterns, we may interpret these shadows as human figures, and thanks to the ominous infrasound, we then may experience a feeling of fear pass over us, and we link that unnerving feeling to the shadow, becoming afraid of it. All of these different circumstances combining can and do create what we know to be the Dark Watchers. And I only say this because we really don't know anything about these quotation mark entities. We know they look like shadows and act like shadows, so why do people assume they are anything more than just that? It comes down to people wanting a good story. They want to believe there's mystery still out there, things left unexplained and unexplainable. I found this to be the case while doing my research for this episode. There were many online articles claiming the same things word for word, almost as if they were all copying and pasting from one another, and then adding their own little facts here and there to embellish the story of the Dark Watchers, when in reality, there is very little in terms of actual source information to confirm they are what people believe them to be. The Chumash Native Americans, for an example, did not have any oral tales of the Dark Watchers, and if Thomas Blackburn, the man who scoured over and collected hundreds and hundreds of narratives about their customs, beliefs, and life, could not provide any evidence that they had, then where are all these authors and websites getting their information from? The answer is simple. They're just making it up. There's no better way to sell a spooky story and make people believe it's real than when you can link the story's origins way back to an ancient civilization. So that's what people have been doing. They embellish the Dark Watcher legend to a point where they are as creepy as they are mysterious, and that has been what has drawn people in. People are drawn to a good story, regardless if the information is true or not. So now, after listening to this episode and all the science I presented, what do you believe? Do you believe the Dark Watchers are real and are stalking the coastline in California, observing everyone who wanders into their territory? Or do you believe people are literally being frightened by their own shadows, thanks to things like pareidolia, the Brockenspector, and infrasound? The answer to this question really just depends on what you want to believe. I will say, while the three previous conditions I had just mentioned are certainly capable in creating the image of a Dark Watcher, we don't know for certain that they are strictly responsible for years' worth of sightings. As much as some people might not want to admit this, there are strange, unknown things about our world we still do not know. The Dark Watchers could have potential to fall into this category. While it seems to me the Dark Watchers can easily be explained away with scientific examples, if those who decide to hike the fog-covered mountains during the fading twilight hours and happen to see a large dark figure off in the distance, it might be best to follow the example set by Pepe Torres, and simply continue on your way and pay the figure no mind. You never know if one of those shadows might be sentient, waiting and watching. Thanks for listening to my Dark Watchers episode. I know the name may have caused some of you to think it was going to be less about facts and information and more so going to be a spooky story, but I firmly believe the truth and facts are just too important to ignore. The Dark Watchers are an extremely interesting, fun legend, but I don't believe they are anything more than just that. Like I said before though, what do you guys think? Do you think I'm possibly wrong and the Dark Watchers really do exist? Have you seen one and want to share your experience, or do you just want to reach out and say hi? You can feel free to message me anytime by email at moonlightlorepodcast@gmail.com or on Instagram at moonlightlorepodcast. I love hearing from you guys, so don't hesitate to reach out. even if it's to disagree with me. I don't mind debating a topic. If you could do me a favor though, if you enjoyed this episode or any other ones I've produced, if you could leave a 5-star review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever else you might be listening to the podcast, it would go a long way in helping the show climb higher in the charts. It only takes a second to do and I would greatly appreciate it. If you wanted to maybe go a step further in supporting the show, sharing it on Facebook, Instagram, or just by telling your friends and family about it would also help a ton. The more listeners who come, the more the show can grow and the more stories I can get to you. I also have a Patreon account for those of you who wish to donate as well. I know money can be tight sometimes, so I don't expect a lot, but if you do choose to donate, I would appreciate that a lot. Any donations, no matter how big or small, goes a long way in helping support the cost of running the show. And for as little as $5 a month, you will gain access to bonus episodes I release on the Patreon monthly. I just recently caught COVID and it stuck around for a lot longer than I was expecting. So right now there are only 3 episodes up on there, but a 4th and 5th are coming very soon. So for those of you who donate so far, stay tuned for those and thank you so much. They'll be good ones. Everyone else though, no matter how small the support, whether it be telling a friend, leaving a review, or simply messaging me to say how much you enjoy the show, it means a lot to me, so thank you so much for that. Now with this episode done, I guess I'm going to go start writing up a new one for you guys. So until next time, stay awesome and I'll see you later.